Today we are looking at the new Ryzen 7 9800X3D from AMD, and we're going to be comparing it mainly head-to-head in today's comparison against the previous gaming king, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. However, of course, in the graphs, I will show you guys some extra CPUs that are out there at the moment, but also the main focus here is the side-by-side comparisons with the 7800X3D, and thankfully for PC gaming enthusiasts, there are some massive gains to be had, at least in particular titles. Now, there are some caveats to the 9800X3D, and in today's review, we are going to talk about all that, ranging from gaming to productivity, right after today's video sponsor. If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $15 After you enter that coupon code BFTYC, you can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Also works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in description below. Welcome back to Tech Yes City. Now, today's video, I did have to cross-reference the results of the Ryzen 7 9800X3D actually across three different motherboards that I had here. One was the B650E Taichi Lite, which I'm actually using for predominantly most of the results in today's video. And I also tested out the Gigabyte X870E Aorus Master, as well as an MSI X870E Carbon Wi-Fi. Now, between all three motherboards, there wasn't really a variance in performance. However, there was a particular mode on the Aorus Master called the X3D Turbo mode, which we will be looking at in a separate video to see how much extra FPS we can extract out of the Ryzen 7 9800X3D when it comes to both overclocking and using different configuration setups like this mode in the BIOS. However, when it comes to memory, here's where we're using the G.Skill 6000 MHz CL28 kit, and we do up this to 6200 with an Infinity Fabric speed of 2067. I find this is a nice little bump for Ryzen CPUs, and it gives out some of the best performance numbers I've seen, as well as not just that, the most consistent numbers, especially when it comes to those 0.1% lows. Though at this stage you're probably like, dude, just start the gaming benchmarks, and I hear you. Let's get into these gaming results, and then we'll talk about all the other nitty-gritties later. And here's where we'll start off with some of the biggest gains first. And this was with Far Cry 6, which is a game that's known to be very single thread dependent. And so this is an interesting one because we saw over a 15% gain when we looked at the 9800X3D versus the 7800X3D. Now, I've also in the graphs just highlighted these two CPUs because for me personally, it's the most interesting comparison here. And we're seeing that the new gaming king is coming in with actually quite a big lead now. So it is good to see this in one generation, not just getting a big boost, but also getting a big boost where it matters to a lot of people, and that's in gaming performance. Then move over to the next game that showed a huge increase too, and this was Age of Mythology Retold. I in particular love this gaming benchmark because it's very CPU dependent in certain areas, and I found that it interacts with the CPU in a lot of different ways that makes it so that only the best gaming CPUs will shine to the top of these charts. And here's where we're getting a 17% increase, showing that the 9800X3D is just quite simply no joke. Now, in the next video that we do talking about overclocking, here's where we also saw a nice benefit to the X3D chip, the 9800X3D chip. And so this is an interesting result to look at even in its basic form here, comparing it apples to apples to the 7800X3D. The next title up here we'll show you is Cyberpunk 2077, and here's where we actually lost one average FPS versus the 7800X3D. So this is the only title that was kind of an anomaly in today's results out of all the games we test, but you also lost performance versus the 7800X3D, and you did so whilst using more power. So kind of an odd result there, and I did check this on Windows 11 as well, and it was a very similar scenario on that platform too. There's also an interesting thing about Cyberpunk was when we compare it to the 9700X, we only really got a 3% performance increase over the non-X3D variant on the 9000 series lineup here. So that was a really weird number to see, but this also kind of carried through with Gears 5, where we saw roughly a 5% increase in performance with the 9800X3D over the 7800X3D. But then when we compare it to the 9700X, we only really saw 11.5% increase here too. So, but depending on the game, you may not get huge gains, and in Cyberpunk, you may just get really nothing. But then we move over to Hogwarts Legacy. here's where we're seeing a nice 10% uplift over the 7800X3D, and then versus the 9700X, it's around about a 20% increase. The final game to show you guys here today is Baldur's Gate 3, and here's where we saw roughly a 7.5% increase in average FPS, but also the 0.1% lows. And this is where I'm going to sort of dedicate a little bit of talking time to the 0.1% lows here. They were on average across the board higher on the 9800X3D. And in fact, Age of Mythology was a really interesting benchmark going back to this quickly, where we could just see in real time the 0.1% lows kind of moving like the average FPS. So this is in particular one thing that I really like about the 9800X3D. It felt like it was AMD's best offering, not just for performance gains in gaming in terms of average FPS, but also the 0.1% lows. It just felt like, as we're talking about with, say, other Ryzen 9000 series CPUs, when it came to snappiness, you could really see that snappiness and lower latency and performance improvements come through and deliver those higher 0.1% lows, especially in the case of the X3D variant versus the previous 7000 series X3D variant. So in ways, when I'm testing out this CPU, I'm not just testing it for the gaming performance, I'm also testing it and monitoring things that I personally really want to extract from a CPU. And so what I feel like is a more responsive CPU in general, I look for that, and I definitely feel like I'm getting something out of the 9800X3D, especially versus the 7800X3D. But let's look at the productivity numbers, which sort of give a bit more credence to this argument, where you can see some huge gains in productivity benchmarks here. And we'll first up here pull up the Chaos suite of benchmarks, starting with V-Ray. And here's where we saw a 35 roughly % increase in V samples with the 9800X3D over the 7800X3D. Moving on to the next Chaos benchmark here, we saw over a 30% gain again in performance with the 9800X3D versus the 7800X3D. Then we're going over to 7-zip. We saw a nice healthy boost here of roughly around 11% performance increase in just overall GIPS. And then onto Geekbench 6, we saw roughly a 20% increase in the multi-threaded performance. Then the single-threaded performance also enjoyed a sizable boost as well. Then the final benchmark here, Cinebench R23, and here is where we got a 27% performance increase in multi-threaded performance, but also, again, the single-threaded performance did enjoy a nice bump. So overall, when it comes to productivity, this CPU is absolutely no slouch. And in fact, it really pleased me to see these numbers, because in a recent video I actually switched my main rig to a Ryzen 9 9950X. But seeing these numbers with the 9800X3D here today, I'm going to fast track that experience and change over to the 9800X3D as my main CPU and my main rig, and tell you guys about the experience in not just gaming on this thing, but also over months of usage, what it's like to use as a main desktop workstation CPU, where I think the results here validate it as a seriously good contender, especially if you're like me and you do a lot of video editing, where a lot of these benchmarks on video editing just don't show you the nuances and the main thing, and that is the graphical user interface interaction is what I'm calling it. It won't show you the time you can save by using a more responsive CPU. And so really looking at these results in depth, I'm seeing that we've got much better performance numbers and productivity scores with the 9800X3D over the 7800X3D. But another thing I'm going to be definitely testing for is that workflow responsiveness. Is those actions per minute going to really eventuate into something that's going to save you time in the long run? That is something that I will report on, because currently in my workflow with the 9950X, I really only use up max of around 50% usage. So seeing these numbers here, it's actually perfect. And it seems like the 9800X3D is going to be a great candidate to drop into my main rig and use as an everyday workstation CPU. And then of course, when I'm gaming on the side, I'm going to know that I'm getting the best FPS bar none. However, let's talk about the caveats now. And that is, first of all, the power consumption. Here's where in gaming, we actually ended up being less efficient than the 7800X3D. And I do test this in Baldur's Gate 3, but one thing to look at with Baldur's Gate 3 is because we're now getting a higher average FPS score, the RTX 4090 is actually going to be using more power to get that higher average FPS. So that is going to skew the from the wall benchmark results here. But we can even see with the direct power consumption monitoring with the software that it is using up more power than the 7800X3D. But even then, if we were to pro-rata that versus the FPS, we're still more inefficient when it comes to gaming FPS. Then moving on to Cinebench R23, it was actually a very similar story here, using up more power from the wall, but also using up more power from the CPU in direct draw. But overall, it wasn't as bad as the gaming numbers, and I think the efficiency kind of balances itself out a little bit more when it comes to productivity, especially with out-of-the-box figures. Though here's where you may be wondering, what do you feel like is the answer to this? Why is the CPU a little bit more inefficient than the predecessor CPU, the 7800X3D? And here's where I'm just going to hazard a guess based on the data I've seen here. And I'm going to say that because the CPU is actually running at a higher clock, if we look at these direct benchmark comparisons, for instance, this CPU likes to turbo up to around 5.225 gigahertz, which is 5,225 megahertz. And at least from my testing, the sweet spot area for the Ryzen 7000 was around 4.8 to 4.9 gigahertz in terms of its sort of max efficiency. After that, you really start to lose a bit of efficiency on the CPU in terms of FPS for the watt. But then on the Ryzen 9000 series CPUs, I actually found it was around 4.9 to 5 gigahertz. So we're running 200 megahertz above that efficiency peak, so to speak. And so that is giving you, although extra performance, it's doing so at a cost of a higher wattage per FPS or per performance metric, whatever you're looking at here. So that was the first caveat of getting the 9800X3D. The second negative I can see here is the pricing. I actually couldn't see the retail pricing as of yet, at least in Australia, so I cannot give you any idea. I'm guessing it's going to come in at around 799 Australian dollars, which is actually quite expensive considering you can get, or you could get, the 7800X3D, at least in relation to its pricing, has kind of gone up in the last few months, where I saw it for as low as around 300 USD a few months ago. And at that point, I was telling everyone, look, this thing's a really good buy at those prices. So if you were to subscribe to Tech Yes City and you see some of those deal videos, you're definitely going to get the right deals at the right time. But here's where we're in USD pricing. We've got official numbers here. It's coming at around 480 USD. And so that's a 30 USD MSRP increase over the 7800X3D. And so you've got a price hike here in one generation. And so for me personally, I'd just like to see it stay at the 449. And I know Intel has sort of paved the way for AMD to just raise their prices if they want to, with the lackluster, especially gaming performance of the Intel Core Ultra 9 285K. However, they've kind of just said, okay, we're just going to raise it 30 USD, which it's not bad, but it's at the same time, I would have liked to have seen it stay at 449, especially since when the 7800X3D was released, there hasn't really been any massive price hikes. That whole inflation wave that we saw, the massive amount of inflation wave that we saw, was actually pre-7800X3D release. But that said, with all that out of the way, it's time for me to give you guys now a conclusion on the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. And what do I think of this CPU? Ultimately, if you guys look at the graphs, you'll see that this CPU is performing extremely well, not just in the gaming numbers, but also the productivity numbers. And my personal experience on the 9000 series CPUs in general is that it is a nice uplift over the 7000 series CPUs when it comes to more important things that I notice personally, and that's things like responsiveness as well as just general usage. So I'm really keen on using this CPU in my main rig. I'm sure a lot of people are going to see this review and ask, should I get this or the 7800X3D, or should I get this or another CPU for productivity? And here's where it ultimately comes down to price. How much can you get a 7800X3D for? If you can get it for around that 300 USD price tag, and all you do is game, it's definitely going to make for a great CPU for the money on the higher end side of things. But if all you're looking at is getting the best performance when it comes to gaming and or productivity, especially for an 8-core, then the 9800X3D is definitely going to deliver. And for a lot of people, I think myself included, it's going to be a best in slot CPU, especially if you're making that hybrid gaming workstation style PC and you really want to get the most for your dollar in terms of just saving time. I think this thing is definitely going to be a hot contender for that title. And I will keep you guys updated in a few months via using this thing in my personal rig. Don't worry, wait for that video, it will come out. But overall, my first impressions of the 9800X3D, very impressed, very nice CPU. I do like what AMD have done with this CPU. Just understand that there are a few caveats, and hopefully I pointed all that out in today's review for you guys. And with that aside, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button for us and let us know in the comments section below what you think of the new Ryzen 7 from AMD. Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always, but also stay tuned because we're gonna have a video on overclocking this thing very shortly coming up in your sub boxes. Look forward to giving you that, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.